Hi, my name is Carlos Rinkin. I am located in Atlanta, Georgia, in Lawrenceville. Um, my skills are full stack web development and Linux network administration and just Linux administration in general. I also do a lot of other things, but those are the things that I generally specialize around. The types of technologies that I'm interested in are emerging technologies like blockchain technologies, microservices, IoT, and many things that are just emerging. I got into programming back in my high school computer science class. They taught us Java, so I have a good foundation in object-oriented programming and data structures and things like that. Everything that you would just naturally learn with Java, just being a really good structured language that it is. I currently have an associate's degree in computer programming. I have an associate's degree in Linux and network administration, and I also have a certificate in Java. And I also have knowledge in C++, but they didn't give me a diploma or cert for that. I enjoy everything that has to do with technology, and I'm currently pursuing a degree in digital electronics um, for making IoT devices and things like that. I also am interested in making operating systems, compilers, interpreters, and I'm interested in languages, and I'm also interested in like programmatic theory, like discrete mathematics, and just from very low level stuff to the highest level that you can do. I'm also interested in e-commerce, like e-commerce, sales funnels, and online digital marketing, like Facebook marketing, Instagram marketing, like just a little bit of everything, basically, like I said earlier. But these are things that I normally just naturally gear towards for some reason.
Cool. So today we're on with Carlos. Carlos is a computer programmer from Atlanta. He you can read all about him in his or hear all about him in his intro. But welcome on, Carlos.
Thank you.
So you're in Atlanta, but you're not originally from there, or you moved there when you were young, right?
Right. So I'm not originally from Atlanta. I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia.
Uh-huh.
So I do speak Spanish pretty well. But I moved to America when I was 3. So I'm a native English speaker.
Cool. And you kind of got into programming at a young age, right?
Yeah, very young age. I got
So
into programming before I knew what it was called.
yeah. So tell me about that. How did that come about?
Well, I'd always been dabbling in programming or just technology in general, just every week breaking my computer and fixing it again. So before I was a programmer, I was an IT specialist, I'd say, is what it's called, a PC technician, I'd say. But then in high school is when I got really into programming in my high school computer science class, where I learned how to program in Java. And that's where I got just my love of programming and my love of um, just the data structures and the fundamentals of just languages in general.
So what about Java what was it about Java that attracted
Uh, it was just the idea of being able to create anything I wanted to. It was sort of like this creative freedom that I could create a superhero, or I could create a building, I could create a car. I mean, it was all abstracted into objects, but to me, it was still the possibility of I can make anything with programming, even though it was all like all in my head. It was never visual. It was just all with code. But I don't know, I still had the ability to sort of visualize like objects in that kind of way with Java. And it just really gave me so much freedom when I first started learning programming. It just so much freedom. It was amazing. And it was extremely interesting. And when I first read the book, it was the first time I ever loved reading. I actually never
you?
really enjoyed like other books that told you adventure stories, or just the Java programming book was exactly the kind of my kind of book. It told you so many raw facts, and it didn't waste any of your time with adjectives trying to describe a bush or describe a character. It was just raw facts. Every sentence was just packed with information, and I loved it.
Yeah, no fluff in the programming
Yeah,
books, that's for sure.
no fluff.
So was that a book that was assigned by the class, or did you just dive into that on your own?
So that was a book assigned by the class, but so after the class was done, I actually knew the librarian that gave out the books, and I actually personally asked them if I could rent the book out for the summer. And he was really interested in that because nobody has ever asked to like rent out school books for the summer, but he let me do it. And so during the summer, I also got to keep the book.
And this was the same Java book, right?
Yeah, it was the same Java book.
And I'm
At the
assuming
time,
you worked through the more complex parts. I mean, my experience in programming and a lot of like, especially intro programming classes, is you work through like the first half of the book, and then you just sort of let the more advanced parts sort of fade away. I'm guessing you were able to like plow all the way through it, right?
so in the class, I actually got the highest grade, and I give that credit to the fact that I did all the exercises in the back and I didn't steer away from the hard things. In fact, I love the hard things, the things like recursion and inheritance. And in fact, the class didn't go over them because they were near the end of the book and a little too advanced and we didn't have enough time. But I took my time to go over them because I just knew how powerful they could be. And they were just really cool words too at the time. They sound cool even now. And to my day, my most favorite thing about Java is generics. That is
Mhm.
generics and inheritance and polymorphism.
Right. I was gonna say when you said there are a lot of cool words in programming, the first thing that came to my mind was polymorphism.
Hmm. And when you
Um,
combine them all, it's crazy. I mean, I wouldn't do it.
right.
I do it for fun. I wouldn't try and do that professionally, but for fun, it's really fun to combine them.
What do you mean to combine them?
Well, when you combine generics and polymorphism and inheritance, it gets a little bit complicated, and sometimes you don't always need that kind of complication. It's really fun to complicate things, but if you don't need to, I wouldn't do it.
Right. You can tie yourself up in a bit of a web if you're not careful.
Yeah, and it's really advanced things, and sometimes I try not to be too advanced because I understand not every programmer is like at that level. And at the time, I was trying to share my code with my classmates, so I wasn't trying to confuse everybody.
Also, you have to fix your own bugs in the future. So if you confuse yourself
Yeah,
now, your your future self is going to be a little mad.
yeah.
So it's we're I'm guessing you worked through a lot of the smaller sort of problems and projects in the book. What was the first thing you actually ever really built, or your first like substantial project, whether in school or on your own or for a client? But how did you first get into like maybe a larger program?
So my most substantial program was actually in that high school class, and we had to make a poker game. At the moment the class was only, I think it was mid semester, and we had only learned like if statements and loops, and the most advanced thing we had learned like was arrays, I think. So just knowing those three things, variables, if loops, just about knowing half the syntax of a language, we had to make a poker game, and it was all in the terminal. But loving the language so much as I did, I made it a visual game, and I spent about 3 weeks all day until about 2 a.m. just doing this because everybody else was doing terminals and they could do it. I could maybe do it in like 5 days, maybe if I wanted to do it on the terminal. But no, I decided to make it a completely visual poker game. So that was my most advanced project.
To start. And did you build all of that in Java? How did you build
Yeah, it
the
was all in
UI?
Java. I only
How did
knew
you build
Java.
the
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So at the time they were only teaching I forgot what it was called, but it's like this old thing, this old Java thing that only lets you do 2D. It's on the EE.
Hmm.
It's I forgot the name, but there's Java FX and then there's one thing before Java FX, and it's that thing.
Is it like what all the old mobile phone games used to be on in like the mid 2000s before the iPhone came out? It's like Snake and all of that stuff was built on there.
Maybe,
Um,
maybe it's really it only does 2D, so
so
it's Java's really basic GUI
uh,
library. And in fact, I think the games are made on Java FX because Java FX is way more advanced than what I was using.
so what was the biggest thing you learned from that? I mean, you kind of went. It sounds like you went above and beyond the project requirements. Like what it.
Yeah. So one huge thing that I learned, and keep in mind this is the first time I'm learning how to program, the one huge thing that I actually learned from that was how to research things that I didn't know. Because at the time I only had this book. as my only source of knowledge. And this book wasn't teaching us how to use graphics in the kind of way that I was using graphics. So I had to sort of learn how to use Stack Overflow. And this was like the very first time I actually even this was like the first time I was even introduced to Stack Overflow.
Yeah, they don't tell you
Which,
about Stack Overflow in the computer science classes. They
yeah,
conveniently skip, hey, here are the answers to all your questions.
yep. And that's when I was introduced to things like just online forums like Code Ranch, Stack
Mhm.
Overflow, documentation. And that's actually when I started getting better at reading the official Java documentation.
Mhm.
I got better at it. I'm now really good at it, but back in the day, it was really daunting to just look at the standard documentation. But
I
now
mean,
it makes a lot of sense.
every language documentation has its own sort of quirks, and you have to sort of navigate the system and get a feel for how they describe themselves as a language to
Mhm.
really get into it and get good at it.
Yeah.
So
Well,
from there, what did you work on after you went above and beyond in your poker
um, could you rephrase that?
game? Yeah. What was your like next sort of big project after your poker game?
Oh,
Was
well,
it
after
was
the
it something?
poker game, my next biggest project was still in the class, and it was the next. I think it was the final, and it was like a shooter game. It was top-down shooter where the shooter was at the bottom, and it would just get enemies. And I created sort of like a Call of Duty Zombies, but with space. So you would just shoot enemies, and it'd be by rounds, and every round you get more and more enemies until it got to the point where it'd be impossible to survive. I also created that in Java. And that's when I got into game design, because previously with poker I wasn't really getting into game design. It was just a lot of if statements and a couple for loops. But when I got into the shooter game, that's when I actually got into like game design and game design object oriented programming and things like that. So it was a completely different level, even though they're both games. The previous one was using simple Java, and then the game one was actually getting into more like sprites and taking into consideration like game development.
Right, and really having an understanding of how to architecture or how to architect something like that, like really
Oh yeah,
develop
that's
game
yeah.
objects.
That's when it really got into the more serious. From the very beginning, you have to kind of think out what is this going to look like,
Right.
scalable wise.
So what was your first intro to programming that was outside of Java, or what was your first language outside of
My first language outside of Java was HTML.
Java? How did you get into HTML? Just hacking around on the web.
Um, I forgot. I think I just wanted to. I totally forget. Maybe I was on YouTube or something, and I just wanted to make a website or something. I don't remember. All these memories are vague. I've learned so much over the years. The only thing I really do remember was Java, because that's just so important in my life. But beyond that, I don't really remember when I learned HTML. But I do know after that I learned HTML and a CSS. And I didn't learn JavaScript at the time. I only knew HTML and CSS. I guess I was making fun websites for myself or something.
So from HTML, CSS, where'd you go from there to, you said not JavaScript. Did you go
Yeah.
Python? Did you
So after that, a couple years passed by. So that's when I was like 15, 16, and then many years had passed by, and then I got into college, and then into college is when I got much more serious into web development, like
go?
extremely serious into web development. In my college, I was actually taking Java classes and C++ classes, but ironically, I learned more about web development, not through the classes, but outside of classes by myself through my friends, because my friends at the time were really into web development.
Yeah, I
So
didn't.
I was
Oh, good.
Mhm. So I was like in college, I was cruising through my Java classes and my C++ classes, because I had already a extremely strong foundation in Java, and they were basically just reteaching me everything I knew in high school. So I was just cruising through those classes. So on my free time, I would be doing web development, and I made a couple friends, and we started a project called the CMV, the Census Map Visualization Tool, which takes the data from the U.S. Census Data Bureau and visualizes it onto U.S. maps. And that's when I first learned JavaScript.
How did you get into that? Tell me more about that project.
So the project it was completely my idea. I had gone to a hackathon in Atlanta, a place called The Garage, and a man from the U.S. Census Data Bureau was presenting the census data to people just to tell them that it existed and things like that. And that's where my idea had sprung up to make the CMV. And so I took that back to college with my friends and I told them about it. And they thought it was a really good idea to just to learn with. So we rolled with that. And at the time, I didn't know JavaScript. I only knew HTML and CSS. So I was working with that. But they were having problems with the Census Data Bureau uh, API and things like that. And I was trying to get things done, but I was only able to make tickets and tell them to do things, but I couldn't do things myself because I was sort of too afraid to look at the code. And it was a mess because going from Java to JavaScript is completely different, even though they sort of have the same name. And I know why they have that, and I know all the history of languages and blah blah blah. But basically, during a break, I think it was probably a spring break or something, I decided to learn JavaScript. So I learned JavaScript in about a week or 5 days. So I learned it in 5 days, and then on the weekend is when I actually started writing the code. And I learned it just through like YouTube and stuff like that. But I learned it in about a week, and then in 3 days I had basically rewritten the entire code base. Not for the better, but I did rewrite it.
Why not for the better?
I could show you actually because at the time when I was first learning JavaScript, one of the things that sort of I didn't completely understand at the time and sort of scared me was the idea of scoping and variable clobbering. And JavaScript also has I always forget these words, but basically scoping. So because I didn't completely understand how JavaScript did its scoping, I sort of separated out JavaScript into what I had called modules. Basically, I had tried to force an OOP paradigm onto JavaScript, uh, where JavaScript
Was
doesn't
not in,
really accept.
right. You,
It,
you
it,
took your Java brain and tried to plug JavaScript into it.
yeah, I had also quickly learned. Well, this is something that I also learned in Java, but basically, when you try and go against what the writers of the language intend for the language, you're basically going up a hill the entire way. Just like with Java, if you try and make Java anything that isn't OOP, you're going to be going uphill. And in JavaScript, I do believe, even though JavaScript is a prototypal language, which is a subvariant of OOP languages, I do believe that the traditional OOP for JavaScript is not the way to go. But doing a prototypal OOP approach to JavaScript is the appropriate way to go because that is the way that it was intended by the original writer. But when you try and take traditional object-oriented paradigms and designs and try and push it into JavaScript, that's when you're kind of going uphill with it and you're sort of forcing yourself into a corner of JavaScript, especially when it has so much to offer and you're trying to force the language to do something that I don't think it was intended to do. It can do it. JavaScript can do a lot of things. That's one of the reasons why it's my favorite language is that you can force paradigms onto it much easier than you can other languages. You could write JavaScript in a functional way. You could write it in an object-oriented way, an imperative way. You can force whatever you want onto it, and it's amazing in that kind of way. But when you try and force it to do something, that's when it like doesn't. That's when it's not happy. You should just
Uh,
let it be free, and that's when I think the language is most happy.
so what is a prototypal? Is that what you said? Prototypal?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So JavaScript is a prototypal object-oriented programming. So if you know about OOP, object-oriented programming, it has lots of variants and sub-paradigms. Java is a sub-paradigm in Smalltalk being sort of like at the top of OOP, and then Java being a little bit below that where it's not pure OOP. There's like think of languages sort of like in the purity of them, where Java
Mhm.
isn't the most purest, even though it's the most famous, and I think it's a really good OOP, but there's more pure forms of objects. And just like in functional programming, you can be really pure with it, like Lisp, or you can sort of like be a little bit in the middle with Haskell, where it's pretty close, but it's not as pure as other languages are.
Right.
Um,
Uh,
so what prototypal basically means is sort of like instead of things being objects, things are functions, and those functions have functions within them, and then those inner functions sort of act like what in normal, so I'm going to, hopefully you know the words here, but an object, when you have a function inside of an object, it's called a method.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to try and force that over here in JavaScript, even though it doesn't have words for it. But basically, when you have a function within a function in JavaScript, you can sort of like access it like a method. You can't make them private or public or anything, but you can sort of do it like an object. And then the way that it's different than Java is that once you make an object in Java, normally you don't try and put methods into it later. So what that would basically mean is if I made an instance of a cat, and then after I made the instance later on, I try to add a method of meow, Java normally wouldn't let me do that. I would have to make the method of meow in the object and then instantiate the cat. But in JavaScript, I can instantiate the cat, and then later on, if I wanted to, I could add a method of meow. And then now only that one instance of the cat has the function meow, and every other instance doesn't have meow. And so that's how it's slightly different than Java. And that's the prototypal thing of it.
Uh-huh.
So you can have like instances that have certain functions that other instances don't, even though they all come from the same cat. And that's one issue that you kind of run into with JavaScript, where you don't know what instances have what functions and what they have, because even though you declare the instance, at any moment in time, you could change the function and you can change its functionality. And basically, even if I made an instance of cat, I could basically rewrite it to be a dog at any time I wanted to.
Cool. So let's dive into maybe some. I know you want to talk about Vue stuff, right?
Yes.
Now I'm not a Vue expert, so I'm gonna really let you explain to me like the high level concepts of Vue, the differences between Vue, React, and Angular, and sort of how Vue works and building real life applications.
Okay. So I don't really know too much about Angular. I have worked with it before, but it was in a hackathon, so I quickly skimmed
And
over
we
the
can drop
docs.
Angular and we can
Yeah.
go Vue versus React.
Okay. So the high level of Vue would be, and I'm sure you know this already, but Vue is an MVC or a model view controller, or it could also be considered MV and then an asterisk because it's MVC, MVCC, MVCV, whatever, all the variations of the MV asterisk. There are a couple. But Vue, I think specifically, is an MV, model view, something like that.
Model
But
view, view model.
yeah.
MVVM.
Yeah. And basically what that means is it separates the data from the view. So what you're actually seeing on the screen is separated from the data, and that level of abstraction is really amazing because it lets you sort of turn these common things like the nav bar and the footer and the sidebars and turn them into what are called components. And basically components are just like the skeleton of what a nav bar is, and then you can just put in your own data like home, about me, things like that in the nav bar, because all nav bars are almost I don't want to say they're all the same, but they basically have all the same structure where it's just this thing at the top or wherever you want to put it, and it has links in it, and then those
Right.
links are linked to wherever you want them to be, and they all have that kind of skeleton structure to them, but what's inside of them and what they look like are all different. So by separating what it looks like and what it actually does into its own things is really amazing because it lets you like take these components and move them to other projects or copy it around your project, in such a way that you don't have to copy and paste. You just constantly re-reference that same component. That way, when you're referencing the same component throughout your entire website, if you ever need to make a change to it, you only need to change it in that one location as opposed to doing like a control F and looking for where it's existing and then having to change it manually. And I
So,
love abstraction. It's amazing.
so how does that differ from something like a React, which is very much component based?
Okay, so the way that it differs from React, because they're both component based, I would say, but the way that it that it differs from React is the way that it implements the MVC. Because they both are MVC, but the way that they implement the MVC is different, and that's where they really shine. Where Vue really shines is in its simplicity and how it doesn't try and create its own language. It really leverages the existing languages that already exist. An example of this would be React uses JSX. If you know JSX, JSX is basically the combination of HTML and JavaScript together. And it's sort of its own, it's not its own language, but it can be considered its own language if you wanted to. Where Vue really shines at this is Vue doesn't try and make its own language. Vue just utilizes the existing structure. So it utilizes the existing HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and it doesn't create its own JavaScript, and it doesn't create its own HTML. It just uses the ones that already exist.
From what I know about Vue, it does a lot more for the programmer than something like React does. Is that correct?
From what I understand in React, it seems like whenever you want to make something, you have to like import it. So you sort of have to understand the entirety of the React ecosystem just to do one thing, because you have to know what to import. Vue, you don't have to import anything more than just Vue itself. All you have to do is import Vue, and everything is sort of already there. You don't have to know anything. You don't have to read the docs for those little tips to try and figure out what you're trying to do. You can just read the docs, and even if you don't completely read the docs, you can really take really good guesses, and it'll get you pretty far.
So
Unlike in React.
would you say it's more all encompassing than React?
Yes.
So in React, obviously, there's React and Redux are often used in the same sort of sentence. Redux obviously being the state management component. Does
Yes.
Vue have anything similar that's sort of built right in terms of state management?
So Vue doesn't have anything that's built in for state management, but Vue does have what is called the Vue Store, which does its state management, and it also has a ViewRouter, which does its routing management.
So how do both of those things work? How does Vue Store work?
So the way that Vue Store works is just like we explained, it's just state management. And Vue, so traditionally Vue, the way that Vue manages state is it manages it through props. And basically props is how components communicate with each other, but it comes to the point where basically you're passing data from one component into an inner component to that inner component, and they sort of communicate like one after in a line. They communicate in a line, but then it gets into the problem where who actually owns the data. And when you ask the question who actually owns the data, you also have to ask the question who can modify the data and who is modifying the data. Because if you have a component that's modifying the data and you don't know that it's modifying the data, then the data sort of becomes in an unknown state. And also you don't know where the data is even going and who has access to the data. So when you put everything into one centralized location in Vue, you know who has access to the data, and it's the state. The state has access to the data, and you can manage exactly how it has access to the data and exactly what you can do to the data, so that you sort of have this standard. You sort of have like this standardization of what is allowed to be done to the data and what is allowed to be accessed from the data.
And so does that implement things like one-way data flows, or how is data? You said it's passed down through props, but how is
Yes.
that?
So previously it's passed down through props, where you have like a parent component, and then that parent component would have access to the data, and then the responsibility of the parent component would be to pass down to the data to its children. And then if those children have children, they pass down the data more and more. And it's sort of like a funnel or a filter, where if you need the last child to have some kind of data, all of the components above it needed to sort of pass the data down.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where it gets into real kind of spaghetti. Because if you needed so let's say you have like 5 components and the last component needed some data, all the components above it needed to pass the data down to it. So you're having to write this line of code 4 more times just to pass it all the way down to the 5th one.
Uh-huh.
In a state world, you only have to write the what you wanted to in the state, and then the 5th component would just have to talk to the state. So it's sort of in a networking kind of sense, it's a star. It's a star network where everything just talks to this thing in the middle. They're just all talking to the thing in the middle, as opposed to a bus where one thing has to talk to another. So if one component failed, the components below it would fail, or even the ones above it would fail. But in a star system, the only thing that would have to fail would be the state itself.
Right, that makes sense. So how does the router, or excuse me, the router work?
Right. So the reason that the router even exists in the first place is because the way that MVCs work is when you load a website, it loads all the data at once. It's sort of like loading all the pages at once, all the JavaScript at once, all the CSS at once, and then it just shows you a view.
Right.
And it just shows you sort of like this view. And when you move to and it's sort of like another way of describing would be sort of like on an application on your phone. When you go into an application on your phone, it just loads the entire app at once. When you switch to a new view on the phone, it's not loading an entirely new website. It's not going out to the server and asking for a new page. It just sort of already existed there. It just wasn't showing it to you at the time. And that's the same way with the MVC model, where everything already exists. It's just not showing it to you all at once. So when you go to a new page, it's not going and grabbing a new page from the server. It already existed there. It's just showing it to you. So because of that, in the little URL, it never changes, because you're not asking the server for a new page. You're always existing on the same page. It's just showing you different aspects of the page at different times. So what the ViewRouter is really important for is sort of for like bookmarking and knowing and sort of having like a visual space of where you are in the website. And what the ViewRouter lets you do is it lets you add to the URL bar at the top of the browser where you are in the web page. So if you go to the contacts, it'll give you a contact URL, so that the next time you go to that contact URL, the website knows to show it the contact view.
Gotcha. No, that makes a lot of sense. Maybe we should open up a code editor, and we can talk about some of this stuff in code.
Okay. Let me share my screen here if I can.
Little green
oh,
button.
that's the thing. Yeah, I'm looking for it. Okay, can you see my screen?
I can see your screen.
All right, cool. So the one I wanted to show you was actually a website that I made for my company, Car Super Services, and I call it the inventory lister. And just a quick context overview. Basically, it's a company that sells auto parts online, and we have this physical inventory that we have in person. It's a physical inventory system that I created myself, and what the business needed was to know exactly. So we organize things in what we call we organize items into boxes, and those boxes have these storage codes. So all these items would be inside of this box. And what we needed to know was which items are in which box. And that was basically it. So I created this system for that, and that's all it is. It also lets you organize by products and storage and zeros and stuff like that.
So what is this? What is this storage hierarchy that you have over here? This A2, 1, 2, A2, 1, 3, A2, 2, 2.
Yeah. So the it's all organized by pallets, and the pallets are sort of in islands, so they're all separated by space. So the A represents which island it's on. The 2 represents the height it is on the island. So if it's on the ground floor, it'd be 0. If it's one above it, it's 1. Usually 1 is at hip height. 2 is usually at shoulder height. Anything above that, it's like above your head. A lot of these aren't on 0. Well, some of them have to be on 0, but so A would be the island, 2 would be the height, and then 1, 2, and 3, because the boxes are really small and we're able to put boxes behind boxes and we're able to stack boxes on top of each other. So the 1 would represent so they're also organized into rows. So 1 would represent the row that it's in, and 3 would represent the number of the box within the row.
You're very much a systems thinker, I can tell. I built an inventory system one time, and it was really fun to do.
Yes. Yeah. I created it in such a way that if we ever scaled, this would hopefully scale infinitely.
Right. You don't have to go in and reorganize everything and restructure the entire foundation.
Yeah.
Cool. So is this the whole little app right here, or there are
Yeah,
other
this is it.
pages?
No, this is it. I used to previously, so I've done more than one project for this company before, and I used to put it all into one website, but for this one I just decided to make it its own individual URL. And it's hosted on Heroku, just on the hobby, so it's completely free. So it takes a couple seconds to like spin it up because it puts it into hibernation, but it works really well.
Well, so do you have the code for this?
Yeah, it's right here.
Yes.
Can you see that?
I can see it.
Okay. So so for this project, what is utilized the best is the state management, actually. So for components, I only have one component, and it's just the inventory lister. I decided to use Pug for this because I don't like the HTML gets really cumbersome, and Pug is just much more simpler for me.
What is Pug?
Pug is a HTML post processor, and basically what that means is when I go to compile it, it'll take this syntax and it'll turn it into actual HTML.
That looks
So
so much cleaner than just HTML.
yeah, yeah, it
I'm
is.
assuming that's why you like it.
Yeah, it's really simple. So for example, this dot section would be the equivalent of doing like a div,
Right.
and within the div, I had like a class of section, and then I'd have to close the div too.
Right.
And so it's basically these two lines of code all in this one line, and then the indentation represents so down here when it stops is when it closes the section. So this is just the way that it looks like visually, and then okay, so for you, somebody who doesn't know Vue, I'm gonna try and maybe erase something so that you can actually just see Vue in its most rawest form,
Yeah, let's do it.
and then I'll take everything back so you can see everything together again.
You have this under version control, right?
Yeah, it's all under version control, but I
Okay.
could also just Control Z.
I don't want to crash anything.
You're fine. Oh well, this is like on my own computer, so the thing that's on Heroku is completely different than this. Yeah. So this is Vue in its most simplest form, and it's basically you have this thing called template, and usually it's in HTML. So you just have this thing called template, and within the template is where you put your HTML. And without the Pug, I would just be putting straight HTML into here. The script is where you put your business logic. This is where you put things like if you wanted to make a calculator, this is where you put your adding and your subtracting and things like that. And your style is just where you put your styles. And your styling it could go down to your lower components, but I usually like to scope it so that it only works on this one component. So looking at the script, not to get too much into it, but just looking over at this right here, the map actions. So this map actions is a view state thing. So it's bringing in the update function over in my store. So if we go over to my store over here, should be something with the word update in here. Here it is.
There it is.
So in my actions, so the way that it works is, and it's down here, so mounted. So Vue has these things that are called life cycles. So as soon as I open the web page, it goes through the life cycles, and mounted is one of the life cycles. Another life cycle would be updated, another would be unmounted, and it's sort of like as soon as I open the web browser, before anything even shows onto the screen, it would run mounted.
Right.
And so what mounted does is it goes over to the store and it runs the update function. And then what the update function is, it shows on the screen, is loading, and then what it'll do is it'll go over to, so I have an API. I don't know if I made it into its own thing. No, I took it down here. So the API is down here, but what it does is it goes over to the API and it gives it, because I work with two companies that sort of live together in the same warehouse, so they have their own APIs.
Mm-hmm.
Or they have their own keys. They have their own keys that they have to work with, and I just combine them together. So this is going to the Paolo one, and then this one goes to the Omar one. Basically what it does is it calls these functions that gets the items from the API. It takes the items, it turns them into, they come back as XML, and then I just turn them into JSON, and then it takes them and it puts them into a object, and then it does the same thing for the Omar one. So it goes to the API, it brings them back as XML, turns them into JSON, and it does that for both Paolo and Omar. And then over here, where it says context.commit Omar items, list items, this is where it actually takes the data and it puts it into the store, or it puts it into the state. So if we go over up here, this is where I have the state defined. Just looking at the Paolo state, because the Omar state and the Paolo state are just the same things, just with different names.
So how might you scale this to work with an arbitrary number of clients?
Oh, that's a good question. The way that I would scale this to work with an arbitrary number of clients is I'd stop using names like Paolo and Omar, and probably, and because right now it's just hard coded, right? So I'm just copying and pasting it twice. If I wanted to scale it in such a way, these would turn into variables, and I'd put all the keys and all the names into its own probably environment folder, and it would just probably loop through the environment folder. And because it's all like all this stuff it's the same code but copied twice.
Right.
And I just did that because I didn't want to. There's no need to scale, but if I did want to scale, it would just be cutting this in half.
Right, and you don't have a lot of code in there right now, so that's something that's totally manageable. But obviously, if you got to the point where it's like 4 or 5 or 6 clients, it'd be a little.
Oh, as soon as I hit onto the third client, that's when I would start considering scalability.
Right. Especially as you want to add new features and you want to test things, and you don't want to have to just copy and paste code, and then you find bugs and you fix bugs and you refactor code. It's you just don't. It's just much better to have things like centralized and then or abstracted in a way that is not hard coded strings.
Mm-hmm. And even though I do have, so right here is just the API call to the thing. I have tried abstracting this away to its own thing, which I call. I've tried abstracting it away over to its own thing called solid commerce. I still haven't finished that, but I'm trying to abstract this away to such a way where I would like import solid commerce, and I would just do like solid commerce dot get list items from, as opposed to having it all in here. I would have it all within its own like management system. Okay.
So cool. So why don't you take me back through some of the state manipulation? Is that something you think you can do?
Is there something you want to look at specifically?
No, just I didn't know if there was anything else in there that was interesting.
No, this in terms of state management, this uses very simple state management for view state. It's just takes asynchronous. So it's asynchronous in such a way that when you just click the update button, it'll get the data, and then once it gets the data, it'll put it onto the website. But no, it just uses the most simplest state management. The documentation for view state is really short. It's about 5 tabs, and of the 5 tabs, I maybe use 2.
Cool. So is there anything else in this project, or did we really run through it?
This is basically it, I think. The meat of the project is here, is the store. This is where the majority of the project is located.
Cool. So
I have other projects for review if you wanted to see those.
No, I think this one is good. Let's hop back into like the normal video.
Okay. Well, actually, there was one I wanted to quickly show you. I wanted to show you my CMV.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
This is the same project you described earlier, right?
Yeah, the census map visualization tool. So in the CMV, I just wanted to show you because this is the very first time I had learned JavaScript. So it's a data structure you might not see anywhere else and you might not ever see ever again. So I organize things so where you see where it says like display.location, display.map,
Right.
display.map.style. These
Right.
are probably file names you've probably never seen before. The way that I organize it is that display is sort of like an object, and the dot location is sort of like an object within that object, and it's basically like scoping in the way that Java does its scoping,
Right.
where display.location should manage everything that has to do with display and location, and display.map should have to do everything with mapping. And
Right. And
map
nothing
is like
else
a
to
sort
know
of like
about anything
display.
else that doesn't need to be that's not relevant.
Yes, exactly. So over in the cmv.init is where it does it. It's just this one simple line of code, and it basically I just create a CMV module. It's just this one object at the top, and then at the bottom, all I do is I start doing cmv.display, cmv.help, cmv.topbar, and it's just a bunch of empty objects. And the way that it works is if at any moment I wanted to do something with maps, I would know that all I'd have to do was call cmv.display.maps, and then whatever function goes after that would have to do with maps.
Mhm.
So if I do that, if I go over to display.maps, so cmv.display.map requests template. So no matter where I am in the project, if I call cmv.display.map request template, I'm going to get this. And that's sort of what I modularized and tried to do with a variable to reduce variable clobbering. And I think it's kind of smart. I wouldn't do it again, but somewhat smart, I think.
No,
Where
I
no
like
matter
it.
where yeah.
If I think you touched on this earlier. If JavaScript was built for something like this, it would like make a lot of sense. But why would you
Yes.
say that you wouldn't do it again?
Um, I don't think because JavaScript isn't really made to be like this.
Right.
I think JavaScript is perfectly fine the way that it is, but this is sort of like when I was first beginning the idea of how do I know where everything is? Like if I did do a map object, how would I know where it's coming from? Because
Right. JavaScript's
if
not
I
really
made a
made
map
to
object
force.
here and I made a map object over here, how do I know which one I'm getting?
Right. Yeah, this one of the things that I don't like about JavaScript is like it's just very fast and loose. I like the enforcement of like strict hierarchies and types and things like that. But
Yeah. So actually, I guess the best way of explaining it would be I did this before I knew what importing and requiring was. So the reason I wouldn't do this in modern day JavaScript is because this problem, or not really a problem I created, is solved by importing.
uh-huh.
But at the time, I didn't know importing or requiring, so I solved a problem that maybe didn't exist or did exist. As you can see, I'm not importing anything. Everything just sort of lives in the global scope. And so this solves the problem of global scoping,
Right.
but without needing to require or import anything. So everything exists in the global.
Cool. So anything else you want to hop over?
No, that was it. I have lots of projects, and it's just I write a lot. It's very tiny stuff, but I do a little bit about everything. And I
Yeah,
also
well,
love lots of languages.
we can throw your GitHub in the the description here.
Okay. Yeah.
So let's dive into some bonus questions before we wrap up.
Okay.
So are
Let's
you
go. Here, how's that?
Well, so let's dive into some bonus questions. Looking back, what would you tell yourself on your first day of programming?
Um, Looking back, I'd probably tell myself, I don't even know.
Or what would you tell someone that was brand new and was just getting into it? What piece of advice? What any warnings?
I don't know. I wouldn't give them advice, but I would tell them where to start.
Where would you start?
I'd give them all the resources of where to start because it's a lot. It's really a
Mhm.
lot, and a lot of
So
people don't even know where to start, and I don't blame them. It's a huge wall of information. When I first started, I knew how much I didn't know, and now I know even less.
that's a great way. Yeah, yeah. The more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah,
It's just you begin as you dig, you realize how deep that well actually is.
yeah. I guess the best advice I could really give anybody is, for anybody but me, would be choose something and just um, finish it and go through it completely. Because for most people, I think, so to be marketable in the market, I believe you have to know something pretty well. And I've sort of hindered myself in such a way that I love it all, and I've sort of become a jack of all trades where I know a little bit of everything, but I'm not really a master at anything. And I think that's what they're really looking for, is they're looking for somebody who can call themselves a master. But I don't call myself a master in one specific thing. I call myself a master in everything because I'm interested in everything. I'm interested in doing everything. So even though that is the most marketable thing, I think I'm still going to continue doing what I do because I basically got into programming because I love it. And I do everything that I do in programming because I love to do it. And I've told everybody this all the time, that if programming, I got extremely lucky that one of my hobbies happens to pay really well. But if this hobby didn't pay so well, I would still be doing it. If this hobby was if this hobby was considered McDonald's level pay, I would still be doing it. I'd still be where I am today because I just love it so much. I just got extremely lucky that I happened to inherit a hobby that pays so much. But if I wasn't so lucky, I'd still be doing it. I'm still doing only what I love. I only do what I love, and I don't do what I don't love.
You take that starving artist concept and apply it to your code editor.
Yeah, because the only times that I'm actually, because I program almost every day, and sometimes I program for months straight, like until 5 a.m. just every time, and I'm not getting paid to do anything. No one's telling me what to do. It's all on my own free will, and I've been doing it for 5 years on my own free will to program just constantly. And it's all because I have such a passion for what I do, and I only have a passion. I have a passion because I do what I love, and if I didn't do what I love, I probably wouldn't be working so hard as I do now.
That's awesome to hear. So next question: what platform, language, or technology that you currently don't know would you most like to learn in the future?
So currently, I would like to get into Golang or Nim.
Why Golang?
Golang because I believe it is going to be a really good systems programming language, or Rust, either Golang or Rust. I have so many in mind, but I want a programming language that isn't that's as fluid as JavaScript, but also lets me touch memory like C.
Mm-hmm.
So I want it to be as fluid as JavaScript, but to let me be as nice as C. And I think Golang is the language for that. It would let me write systems languages, possibly kernel code, things like that, things that are really close to bare metal. And I think Golang or Rust would be those languages for me.
So what was your most negative programming experience or interview, and then on the flip side of that, what's your most positive programming experience or interview?
Almost negative programming experience. I guess my most negative programming experience, I have tried going to like, I forget what they're called, but like hiring events where
Mm-hmm.
it's a bunch of businesses that set up tables and they take your cards and you get like a 2-minute spiel, and it just felt like a complete meat house. Like, you know, I'm
Yeah,
just talking to
I can.
somebody.
Yep.
Yeah, and I'm just talking to somebody. I just give them my number, and I'm somehow supposed to impress them within 2 minutes, and you can't really do that. I can't explain my many years of experience in 2 minutes, and I just can't. And it just felt like a complete meat house, and it just didn't feel like they were caring at all. Like all they needed was people on heating up chairs.
Yeah, I totally understand your frustration around that. So on the flip side, most positive.
Most positive experience? My most positive experience is really just when um, all of them, when anybody just takes the opportunity and their time to just listen to me. Because I apply a lot, but of many, I don't really get many back. So any opportunity I get to even just talk to anybody else, um, and I get to learn from what's even out there and what people are even looking for, actually looking for. It's a nice experience.
If you could relay one message about programming or tech to people that are non-technical, what would that be?
Um, I guess to people non-technical to relate to programming. I don't want to say this because I don't want more competition, but it's also kind of true. Programming is sort of becoming the new English or the new math, where nobody goes around screaming, "Oh, I can't read." It's embarrassing to not be able to read, and it should be embarrassing not to be able to read code, I think, because everybody uses technology so much, and even just being able to know how to code just a little bit or understanding the underlying infrastructure of just about anything that you use can benefit you, and utilizing the tool that you use so much better.
Makes sense. So last one, and this is stolen from Tim Ferriss, but if you could put any message on a billboard that only programmers would see, so programmers are driving down the highway, a million programmers a day drive down the highway and they see a big giant billboard. What would that message be, and where would you put it?
I don't know what I'd want to tell a bunch of programmers. What would they need to know?
They need to know
They're all
all sorts of things.
they're all on their own journey. They're all doing their own thing. I don't know what kind of centralized messages I could send to all the programmers.
Now, if you were to start the cult of Carlos, what would that cult be?
I don't know. Probably just the same Linux cult, just a continuation on the Linux cult
Any opinions you would like to express in that area, though,
of Linux.
or just the programmers in general?
Um, I guess one tip that I live by, I could put it on the billboard, and that one tip would be don't use anything that has to do with Microsoft. And
Why
it's
that? That sounds like
oh, it's just something I've learned throughout the years that historically it not just like recently, but it has historic backing to what I'm saying. Where usually anything that Microsoft, maybe it was back in the day, I don't know about the new Microsoft. The new Microsoft is trying to it's trying to wrap itself into a new kind of way with Git and Visual Studio. But historically, back in the day with Java and things like that, anytime Microsoft touched anything, even if it wasn't within the 1 year, even if it happened 7 years later or 8 years later or 10 years later, it always was no good for the developer community and people who program in general.
well, being no good, buying GitHub and being no good for the developer community are very much antithetical. Or
Well, even I believe as soon as they bought GitHub, they allowed people to have private repositories for free, and everybody cheered, but I didn't see it as a cheer. I sort of saw it as you're making it easier for people to hide their code in a community where we
value
love,
open source.
yeah, where we value open source and we value freedom of code. Making it easier to hide code isn't benefiting the community. It's the opposite. It's making it easier for people to hide their code, which I understand is great for people who want to hide their code, but thinking about it as if looking at the freedom of code is positive, then the lack of freedom of code must be a negative.
Makes sense.